squeeze in a read for Ireland Reads on the 25th of February.
My name is Robert Gogan, and I'm here today on this short video to tell you a little bit about James Joyce's Ulysses, and hopefully give you a few pointers as to how you can read the book and make sure that you get some enjoyment from it. And the two aspects that I want to cover of Ulysses today is its uniqueness and also the difficulties involved in reading it. So if we start with the uniqueness of Ulysses above any other novel, Ulysses, when it was first published, had 732 pages in it, and most of the editions you buy today have in around the same number of pages. So most people, when they would be reading a book of that sort of thickness, expect that it's a bit of a saga that's going to go on for weeks and months, or in a timeline of even years and sometimes even centuries. And there's going to be wars in it and murders in it and intrigue and love affairs and love stories and one thing or another. The fact is that Ulysses is nothing like that. Believe it or not, with 732 pages, all of the action in the book takes place on just one single day. And that's June the 16th, 1904. And in fact, it's not even 24 hours, it's about 18 hours. So the next thing that I'm sure a lot of people will be asking is, well, what in the name of God can you write about for 732 pages that didn't even take a day? And this is where some of the uniqueness of James Joyce's Ulysses comes into it, because I don't think there's too many writers out there who could have done anything like what Joyce did in relation to it. The second unique thing is the subject matter of the book, what happens. And basically speaking, very little really happens if you boil it down. Joyce kind of follows two different individuals throughout the day in their various activities in Dublin. And they eventually end up meeting at the end of the day. And I won't tell you any more than that because you've got to read the book to see what happens after that. So what Joyce ends up doing is making or justifying the ordinariness of our lives. Most people feel, if you meet them some evening and say, well, anything happened today? And the question and the answer most people will give is, nah, nothing, didn't do anything. But in fact, you got up in the morning and you thought about stuff, and you went out and you started your car and you met people, or you bought some stuff, or you might have even gone to a film or something. But you consider it terribly ordinary, and in a way, a lot of that is terribly ordinary, but it's terribly important as well. It's very important, so much so that Joyce was able to write this magnificent novel, really dealing with two people who did very little of any consequence in a particular day. But I wouldn't let that put you off it, because once you get into the book and you get into the characters, you begin to realise that there's an awful lot more going on in everyone's life than what we think about. Now, the other thing that makes the book unique is the way in which Joyce wrote it. Joyce was, by the feelings of most people around the world who have read or studied his works, and including myself, he was a genius at writing. And most authors that you'd know about out there, you'd recognise with a particular style. And that's grand. Hemingway, Dickens, Agatha Christie, Cecilia Hearn, and all of these people, they have a style. They write with that style. They write very, very well, but they have a style of writing that you get into and you recognise, and all their books basically work more or less in the same sort of style. But Joyce, because he was such a genius of a writer, didn't do that. He wrote part of the book, the first part of the book basically, in a very, you might call, nondescript style of narrative and dialogue, etc., etc. But halfway through the book, he starts writing in completely, utterly different styles. He even writes one chapter as if it were a piece of music. And the reason he did it, one of the reasons is, first of all, because he loved the English language, and secondly, because he was able to do it. And that's the two main things that make Ulysses a unique book, and definitely well worth reading, because it's an experience as well as just the reading of a novel. But what I want to do here on this video is give you some hints as to how you can tackle this book and also enjoy it. Because it is a work of art and it needs to be enjoyed. And I hear too often from people who say, well, I read Ulysses, I didn't really understand much of it, but I read it because I wanted to be able to sit down and tick a box and tell all my friends down in the pub, I have read Ulysses. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But wouldn't it be so much better if you could enjoy what you're reading? So we'll go now towards what are the main reasons Ulysses has been such a challenge and is so unique for people. Why is it so difficult? And why is it mainly that a lot of people actually put the book down and abandon it within the first 30 pages or so? So they haven't even got to the different styles of writing that Joyce uses. They've missed out on so much stuff, and they don't even end up meeting the main character, Leopold Bloom. And the reason for this is not because they can't understand the words, not because there are so many characters in the book, like I think you have with books like War and Peace and that you get so confused you don't know where you are and you put the book down. They're not the reasons people put the book down. The reasons they put the book down is because they get lost. And one of the main quotes you get from most people is, I put it down because I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea who was doing what or who was saying what. And the reason for this is one of the things that makes Ulysses so unique, and it's called the expression of the stream of consciousness. Now, what is a stream of consciousness? I can hear a lot of you asking. And it's very, very simple. A stream of consciousness is your thoughts. Right. So we have to analyse thoughts before we go into how Joyce actually dealt with them, because this is terribly important, because this permeates the entire Ulysses book. Think about your thoughts for a minute. Well, first of all, we all are thinking all the time during the day while we are awake. Thinking all the time. We're thinking of things that have happened, impressions we have of things, things we notice happening on the street or in the office or in the home as we go around the day. Our hopes and dreams, everything is going through here all the time. And you often hear the phrase from people, I wish I could get my head out of my head. And that really means these are buzzing around all the time. Even when you're talking, even when you're eating, when you're probably in the toilet as well, and that's relevant to Ulysses, and everywhere you're thinking. But your thoughts, or our thoughts, they don't have a structure. It could be a word, a phrase, a fleeting microsecond of time. They've no structure. They certainly don't have a beginning and an end like your average sentence in a book. And they're not structured in any way. They're just whirling around all the time. Now, Joyce used this stream of consciousness technique to bring several of the characters, particularly the main ones, to life. And he used the stream of consciousness exactly as we as human beings use it. In other words, the stuff gets thrown in exactly where Joyce thinks that the character will start thinking this. Now this is where the real problem begins, and it begins on page 1. Because in most editions of Ulysses, almost 100% of them, almost, there is no differentiation between the thoughts of a character and the narration and the dialogue. In other words, there's a piece of dialogue, there's a piece of narration, and if a thought process, if a stream of consciousness needs to be introduced by Joyce, it goes straight in to that piece of dialogue or the piece of narrative in the middle of the sentence. So what happens with everybody, basically, is they're reading along, they've gone down halfway down the first page where two characters are having a bit of a chat at the Martello Tower in Sandy Cove in Dublin, and everything is going very well, and they think, don't know what people thought was so difficult about this looks pretty straightforward. And out of the blue, they come across a word that has nothing to do with anything they've already read. And they haven't read a lot at this stage, but it's got nothing to do with it. And they say, as I did the first time I read the book, I must have missed something there, something very subtle. So you go back and read a few more paragraphs before to see if you just missed something. And you kind of realise, I don't think I did, or else I'm too thick that I didn't notice it. But the fact is that you didn't miss anything. And you read on, and then within another page or two, the same thing happens. and another page, and the same thing happens, and the same thing happens. And you begin to become very confused because you really don't know what's going on. You're reading this conversation between Buck Mulligan and Stephen Dedalus in the Martello Tower, but then there's a load of other stuff being thrown in everywhere, and you have no idea what it's about. And Joyce never actually used any wording such as Stephen thought this, or a thought came into Stephen's head, blah, blah, blah. The thoughts go in with no introduction, no warning they're there, no different punctuation, nothing. And what normally happens with the vast majority of people is that after 20 or 30 pages of absolute struggle, they put the book down and they say, that's it, I'm not reading it anymore. And I kind of don't blame them in a way, because it really is difficult. So there are two ways I would suggest you, and if once you conquer this problem of the stream of consciousness, you will get through Ulysses and you will enjoy it. So I would suggest there are two ways that you take this book on board. One is you buy a regular copy of Ulysses that's available in the shops, and there's many editions of it now. And you sit down and you realise to yourself, this is going to be a long haul. I'm going to have to read it very slowly, and then once I hit all these streams of consciousness, I'm going to stop and kind of almost analyse them. What parts of this sentence don't make sense? Okay, this must be Leopold Bloom thinking, or Stephen Dedalus thinking, or whatever. And fine, and there are people who will do that and will enjoy doing it, and it's quite a challenge. But the vast majority of people don't want to do that with a book. People want to pick up a book and read it. They don't want to have to pick up a book and study it from page 1. So that is a way of doing it, and you will get through it, and it will be enjoyable enough to read, if not quite a challenge. The other thing you could do is you could pick up in the library, or indeed in a bookshop, you could pick up an edition of the book which I edited. And I want to show it to you here now. It is called Ulysses Remastered. That's the cover of the book, it's just come out, it's a special centenary edition. And the reason I called it Remastered is because I took all the streams of consciousness in the book and I left them exactly where they were, exactly as Joyce wrote them, but I just put them into italics. So as you're reading through the book, once you hit a bit of italics, you know you have slipped immediately into one of the characters' streams of consciousness, their thoughts, and you can take it from that point of view and read it. Because another very important point about these streams of consciousness are they don't always make sense. Our thoughts don't always make sense. They certainly don't make sense to anybody else. If they could read our mind, they'd be wondering, what the hell are you thinking that for at this stage? And you'd be saying to them, oh, well, I saw that little thing on holidays 2 years ago in Spain and it just crossed my mind again. And this sort of thing happens. So you will have to take on board, which is important, that quite a considerable amount of the thoughts that you will read don't make any sense to you. And they don't, because as far as Joyce is concerned, you are gate crashing in somebody's head. You're in one of the characters' heads and they don't know you're there, so they're not going to try in any way to explain it to you. But once you know it's in italics, you can quite comfortably say to yourself, I've no idea what that means, but that's Stephen Dedalus thinking, and it's probably not important. I'll give you one example, the very first example in the book, which is not an easy one. Joyce isn't doing anybody any favours here. And I'll just take this, that Buck Mulligan is looking out over the sea on the Martello Tower, and I'll just read this little bit here. He peered sideways up and gave a long, low whistle of call, then paused a while in rapt attention, his even white teeth glistening here and there with gold points. Chrysostomos. 2 strong, shrill whistles answered through the calm. We were doing very well there for a while, with Buck Mulligan and his even white teeth, etc. And then Chrysostomos. What is that? What's it doing there? How did I miss it? What's its significance? This is Stephen Dedalus having a fleeting thought in his mind about 2 characters from history whose names were Chrysostomos. And they were both renowned for having gold in their teeth, gold-filled teeth and that sort of thing. And Stephen, looking at Buck Mulligan, suddenly thought that. Now, if you don't have, and in this book that I just read, the Chrysostomos is in italics, so you know immediately this is Stephen thinking. So this is the sort of thing that comes up in the book and is very important for you to know about. Very briefly as well, you've got to realise that the very beginning of Ulysses is one of the most difficult parts of the book, because you deal with Stephen Dedalus for the first 3 episodes before you get to the main character, Leopold Bloom. And Stephen Dedalus is, you might call a thinker. He's an academic, he's an intellectual, he's a classically trained ex-student, and he's very introvert. So when Stephen Dedalus's streams of consciousness come into the book, it is highly unlikely you're going to know an awful lot about what he's thinking, because he's thinking about Aristotle and other very obscure writers and different theories and things like this. We basically say goodbye to Stephen in general after the episode 3, and we go to Leopold Bloom, is much more like you and me, an ordinary Joe Soap or Josephine Soap thinker. So keep that in mind, that Stephen Dedalus is particularly difficult, but because if you recognise the streams of consciousness, you can say to yourself without being frustrated, I've no idea what Stephen's thinking about, but I don't really have to, because in general it doesn't affect the book. So that is a very, very brief introduction to Ulysses. But if you take those points on board and perhaps pick up either in the library Ulysses Remastered, and it's also available in bookshops as well, that is the most enjoyable and easiest way for you to read Ulysses. So I wish you all the very best of enjoyment and happiness when you take up Ulysses and read it, and can tell people afterwards, not only have I read Ulysses, but I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Squeeze in a read for Ireland Reads on the 25th of February.